For years, Russia believed its greatest advantage in the south was the sea itself. The Sea of Azov served as a protected logistics corridor, while the Black Sea allowed Moscow to move ships, launch missiles, and project naval power far from the front lines. Then the attacks began. What started as a wave of Ukrainian drone strikes in the Sea of Azov did not stop there. It crossed into the Black Sea, turning waters Russia once considered secure into an active battlefield. The question was no longer whether Ukraine could reach Russia's naval strongholds, it was how far this campaign was about to spread. On the map, the Sea of Azov appears almost sealed off. Tucked behind Crimea, it is linked to the Black Sea through just one narrow passage, the Kerch Strait. For years, Russia treated this sea as its own private lake, a safe rear area sitting comfortably behind the front lines. On the night of the 14th of July, 2026, that sea was still burning, with Russian vessels sitting disabled and drifting after 9 straight nights of drone strikes. And it was at that exact moment, with smoke still visible on the water, that Russia's own foreign minister chose to stand in front of a room full of cameras and call the entire campaign an act of terror. Standing beside Chad's foreign minister at a press conference in Moscow, Sergei Lavrov delivered a line that was clearly meant to define the story before anyone else could. He said that what Ukraine was doing wasn't even piracy, because pirates at least steal for themselves, while this was simply meant to inflict damage and spread fear. He called it pure terrorism. Here is the detail that makes this moment worth pausing on. Lavrov was speaking about attacks on ships, yet he never once mentioned that Russia itself has struck 59 merchant vessels since the war began, including a German-owned cargo ship carrying 25,000 tons of corn meant for Ukraine. He stood at that podium, accusing Ukraine of terrorizing civilian shipping, while leaving his own government's record on civilian shipping completely out of the conversation. Less than 24 hours later, while those same Russian ships were still smoldering in the water, the answer came, and it did not arrive through a diplomatic channel or a formal statement from Kyiv. It came from the commander who had actually been running the strikes, posting directly on Telegram in plain, blunt language. Robert Brovdy, the man leading Ukraine's unmanned systems forces, wrote 4 words that would define the next chapter of this war. No piracy, Lavrov, just business. Yours, bloody. A Russian foreign minister had just tried to frame Ukraine as the aggressor on the world stage, and the man commanding the drones simply answered him in public, on the same platform, in the same breath as announcing his next set of targets. Because buried inside that same post was something far bigger than a comeback line. Brovdy confirmed that his forces had just struck another 20 Russian vessels, this time not in the Sea of Azov, but out in the open Black Sea. And that detail is exactly why this moment matters so much. Whatever had been happening in the Sea of Azov over the previous 9 days was apparently no longer contained to that one body of water. It had just crossed into a completely different sea on a completely different coastline, and the man responsible for it was taunting Russia's top diplomat while doing it. To understand exactly how a single naval campaign grew large enough to provoke Russia's foreign minister into calling it terrorism on live television, we need to rewind 9 days back to the very first night this operation began. If you're joining this breakdown, hit subscribe. 9 days before that press conference, Ukraine's unmanned systems forces launched an operation they gave a strange, almost domestic-sounding name, Molochka, which translates roughly to dairy or milk products. Whatever the name suggests, there was nothing gentle about what followed. Night after night, from July 6th through July 14th, Ukrainian drones returned to the same stretch of water, striking Russian vessels over and over until the operation built into one continuous, expanding scoreboard. According to Brovdy's own public count, that scoreboard reached a staggering total by the 9th night. 116 Russian vessels struck in just 9 days, a number he posted openly on Telegram along with footage of the strikes themselves. That is the figure Ukraine's own commander announced to the world, and it is worth being precise about that detail because it is Kyiv's claimed tally, not an outside verified count. To understand just how relentless this pace actually was, look at a single night in the middle of the campaign. On the night of July 10th into the 11th, Ukrainian drones hit 28 vessels in one continuous strike, the single largest overnight total of the entire operation. 21 tankers, 4 tugboats, 2 cargo vessels, and 1 specialized vessel, all disabled within the same stretch of darkness. That is not a scattered handful of lucky hits. That is a coordinated, sustained assault, returning to the same hunting ground night after night, refusing to let up. Poland's OSW Center for Eastern Studies, an independent research group tracking the war closely, reviewed the available satellite images and video and concluded that at most a dozen or so vessels appear to show serious, confirmed damage, and questioned whether all of these ships genuinely belong to Russia's sanctions-dodging shadow fleet, or whether some were simply ordinary local shipping. That skepticism does not erase the story here, though, and this is exactly where the twist comes in. Whatever the true number of ships damaged turns out to be, an entire body of water that Russia had treated as a safe internal lake for years became, over the course of 9 nights, too dangerous to reliably operate in at all. And that is a far bigger problem for Russia than any single disputed number could ever be. Because while analysts argue over exact vessel counts, Russia's own actions told a very different story, one that needed no verification at all. On July 10th, for the first time in this entire war, Russian authorities suspended commercial shipping through the Don Azov Canal, the inland waterway connecting the Don River to the Sea of Azov. And Russian border guards stopped accepting requests to pass through the Kerch Strait as well, closing both of Russia's own maritime routes into that sea at nearly the same moment. No outside government forced Russia to do that. No sanctions committee voted on it. Moscow made that decision entirely on its own because the water had become too dangerous for its own ships to use safely. When the country under attack starts shutting down its own infrastructure without being asked, that tells you something no drone footage or disputed vessel count ever could. The ripple effect reached markets almost immediately, and this is where the story stops being confined to a single sea and starts touching ordinary people's lives far beyond Ukraine or Russia. Wheat futures on the Euronext exchange jumped by roughly 4% within days of that canal suspension, because a meaningful share of Russian grain exports normally moves through exactly this route on its way to buyers around the world. A handful of drones hitting ships in a sea most people outside the region had never thought about had just moved a global commodity price. And that raises the question that should be sitting with you right now. If striking small, flat-bottomed tankers in a shallow sea can shut down a canal, choke a strait, and shake a wheat market all within days, what exactly was Russia doing to make itself this vulnerable to something so small and so cheap in the first place? That vulnerability did not appear by accident, and understanding it starts with a piece of ordinary geography that Russia never expected to become a weakness. The Sea of Azov averages only about 7 meters deep, which is far too shallow for the massive ocean-going tankers Russia depends on for its export trade. Those giant vessels simply cannot get close enough to Russian shore terminals to load directly. So Russia built a workaround, a second fleet of small, flat-bottomed feeder tankers, roughly 140 meters long, shallow enough to move freely through water that would strand anything larger. These feeder boats carry oil down through Russian rivers and out into the Azov, where they transfer their cargo onto the big tankers waiting offshore. One large export tanker typically needs supplies from 12 to 15 of these smaller feeder boats just to fill up completely. Bravdi himself described this fleet in a way that is stuck with anyone following the campaign closely. He called these ships the worm camels of the sea, small, unglamorous, and constantly shuttling back and forth, doing the unseen labor that keeps Russia's entire export chain moving. And his forces were not simply sinking them either. According to his own public statements, Ukrainian drones were striking these vessels rather than sinking them outright, turning them into drifting, burned-out hulks left floating in the water as a warning to every other vessel still operating nearby. A sunken ship is a loss Russia can quietly write off. A disabled ship drifting through an active shipping lane, visible to every other captain out there, tells a very different story to anyone thinking about making the same crossing. That fleet became such a valuable target precisely because almost nobody was watching it. For 4 straight years, Western governments poured enormous effort into sanctioning Russia's large ocean-going tankers, the ones crossing the Atlantic and the Indian Ocean toward buyers in Asia. The European Union eventually built a formal list of 632 vessels. British authorities boarded the tanker Smirtos in the English Channel. France seized another vessel, the Deliver, as it left a Russian port. Cameroon deregistered dozens of ships that had been sailing quietly under its flag. All of that pressure, years of diplomatic and naval effort, was aimed squarely at the big tankers on the open ocean. The small feeder boats sitting in shallow water near Crimea were never part of that conversation at all. And even when Western pressure landed directly on the big tankers, it barely slowed Russia down. By April of 2026, despite that entire sanctions list, 111 of those 632 designated vessels were still actively loading Russian oil. Separate tracking by the Kyiv School of Economics found that roughly 75% of all Russian crude oil exports were still moving through this shadow fleet system as of that same spring, and that 92% of the tankers carrying it were more than 15 years old, aging, rust-streaked vessels held together well past what any responsible shipping company would normally allow. A list with no teeth and a fleet of old ships still hauling billions of dollars in oil. That was the system Russia had built to keep its war funded. Russia's response to the growing Western pressure on its larger tankers is exactly where this story takes its sharpest turn, because the fix Moscow chose ended up creating the very weakness Ukraine would later exploit. As European coast guards grew bolder, Russia began reflagging its shadow fleet under its own flag instead of the fake or stateless registrations it had been using. The logic seemed sound at the time. A foreign coast guard is far less likely to board a ship flying Russia's own flag than one sailing under a shell company registration with no clear nationality. Between May of 2025 and April of 2026, the share of shadow fleet oil moving on Russian-flagged vessels jumped from just 3% to 23%. That decision looked like protection. It was actually the opposite. And this is the twist that changes how you should read this entire campaign. Under international maritime law, specifically the rules laid out in the San Remo Manual governing naval warfare at sea, an enemy-flagged vessel carrying cargo that sustains that enemy's war effort is not a legal gray area at all. It is an unambiguous military target. A ship flying a fake flag from Panama or Cameroon might create legal confusion about who actually owns it. A ship proudly flying the Russian flag, carrying Russian oil, funding Russia's own war, removes every bit of that confusion instantly. Moscow did not slow this process down either, even as the risk became obvious. At the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum in June of 2026, Vladimir Putin personally announced ambitions to build one of the largest domestic merchant fleets in the world. That same month, Russia's own Ministry of Transport proposed making registration under the Russian flag faster and simpler. While Ukraine was quietly studying this exact fleet, Russia was actively advertising just how much of it now belonged to the state, on a fleet estimated to generate roughly $85 billion a year in energy revenue for the Kremlin. So, by the time Ukrainian drones started hunting these vessels in early July, Russia had spent nearly a full year handing its own oil fleet, a target sign it could not remove, sitting on top of a shallow sea it never expected anyone to bother attacking. The strikes were impossible to ignore. But the real story lies in the weapon making them possible. What kind of drones was Ukraine using? Because whatever weapon was doing this had just spent 9 nights crossing open water, finding small moving ships in the dark, and hitting them with enough precision to disable a fuel tanker rather than simply missing it entirely. The most convincing answer came not from Kyiv, but from an independent voice with no reason to inflate Ukraine's capabilities. Roy Gardiner, a former Canadian military officer and drone warfare analyst, identified the weapon publicly as the FP2, a Ukrainian-built strike drone, and explained exactly why nothing else made sense for this particular job. In his own words, it was the only unmanned aircraft available in large enough numbers, and with enough range to carry that much explosive, other than Ukraine's long-range AN-196 Lyuty, which is far more expensive and frankly illogical to use for a mission like this. That distinction matters more than it sounds. The Leo-T is built for deep strikes, hundreds of kilometers inside Russia, an expensive, long-endurance weapon meant for high-value targets like refineries and air bases. Sending one after a 7,000-ton feeder tanker in a shallow coastal sea would be like sending a cruise missile after a delivery van. The FP2, on the other hand, was built for exactly this kind of mid-range, high-volume punishment. The FP2 itself has a fairly short history, and that history explains why it suddenly became the perfect tool at exactly the right moment. Ukrainian manufacturer Firepoint first unveiled it publicly at a defense exhibition in Poland back in September of 2025, built on the design of an earlier long-range strike drone the company had already fielded. Then, at the Paris Air Show in June of 2026, just weeks before this campaign began, Firepoint unveiled an upgraded version with a new wing carrying an integrated fuel tank, allowing it to fly further while carrying a heavier punch. Firepoint's co-owner, Dennis Stielerman, confirmed the upgraded drone could now carry a 200-kilogram warhead out to a range of 370 kilometers. What makes the FP2 genuinely suited to hunting ships, rather than just striking fixed buildings, is how it gets guided onto a moving target in the first place. Stielerman confirmed that an operator can steer the drone manually through a radio link, watching its camera feed in real time and adjusting its final approach, which is exactly what you need when the thing you are trying to hit is a tanker drifting slowly across open water rather than a building sitting still on a map. Somewhere behind every one of those burning ships in the Azov was a Ukrainian operator sitting at a screen, making the final call on exactly where and when to strike in the middle of the night from a position possibly hundreds of kilometers away. But how does an operation keep hitting new targets every single night for 9 nights straight without ever appearing to run low? According to reporting on the company's output, Firepoint is now assembling roughly 300 FP2 drones every single day, alongside a smaller daily output of its long-range Flamingo cruise missiles. A campaign that size is not a lucky one-night raid stretched into a headline. It is a factory floor turning into a sustained military campaign in real time. And the FP2 was never the only weapon in play here either, which is where this story reveals something even more uncomfortable for Moscow. Separately from Pravda's own unmanned systems forces, Ukraine's security service, the SBU, was running its own parallel campaign entirely, using a completely different weapon called the Sea Baby, a surface-skimming naval drone rather than an aircraft. On July 8th, while USF drones were still working through the Azov, the SBU independently struck a separate Russian Shadow Fleet tanker near Yalta using one of these boats. The upgraded Sea Baby carries a payload of up to 2,000 kilograms, can travel roughly 1,500 kilometers, and moves at nearly 49 knots across open water. Two entirely separate Ukrainian institutions, using two entirely different kinds of weapons, one flying and one skimming across the waves, were hunting the same Russian fleet during the exact same week, apparently without needing to wait on each other's timetable. That is not one clever unit improvising a single lucky operation. That is an entire security establishment converging on the same target from multiple directions at once. It also explains something that should have seemed impossible on paper. The Black Sea itself stretches more than 1,175 kilometers at its widest point, far beyond the FP2's 370-kilometer reach from Ukrainian territory. Yet when satellite imagery captured the Russian fleet regrouping there after fleeing the Azov, those ships were not scattered safely across that vast open water at all. They were sitting in tight clusters just off Russia's own coastline, close enough that the exact same drone already burning through the Azov could reach them without any trouble whatsoever. Which raises a question Russian commanders were about to find out the hard way. If a weapon already this cheap, this fast to build, and this precisely guided could empty one sea in 9 days, what happens the moment its operators simply turn around and point it at the next one? What happened next stops looking like an accident of drone footage and starts looking like exactly what it was, a sea being systematically emptied. Satellite images published through the European Space Agency's Copernicus program, taken on July 11th and 12th, show the Sea of Azov almost completely clear of large vessels outside one sheltered bay. That is not a claim from a Telegram post. That is a photograph from space. The numbers behind that photograph tell their own story of collapse. According to tracking data from ISW's Starboard Maritime Intelligence, there were 267 vessels actively broadcasting their location across the entire Sea of Azov on June 30th, right before this campaign accelerated. By July 11th, that number had fallen to roughly 120, a drop of more than half in less than 2 weeks. By the following day, Defense Express estimated only around 25 vessels remained clustered near the southern coast, the majority of them ordinary dry cargo ships rather than tankers at all. By July 12, over 50 Russian vessels were concentrated in the Black Sea beyond the Taman Peninsula, staying 15 to 30 kilometers off the coast in an apparent effort to keep outside the range of Ukraine's FP drones. To grasp how dramatic that collapse really is, picture the same body of water just 1 month earlier. Reuters reported more than 40 vessels simply waiting their turn near the Kerch Strait in early June, a completely ordinary sight for a sea Russia had treated as safe territory for years. Within weeks, that same stretch of water had gone from a crowded, functioning shipping lane to something Russian vessels were actively fleeing. Russia's own government could not hide the disruption either, even while trying to downplay it. The country's agriculture ministry publicly acknowledged the situation, stating that alternative routes were being explored and that cargo might need to shift to other modes of transport entirely. That disruption reached beyond oil tankers as well. Industry sources told Reuters that several grain vessels were also struck on July 13th and 14th alongside the tankers, on a route that normally carries roughly a quarter of all Russian wheat exports leaving the country. Officials insisted the disruption would not affect domestic food supply or Russia's export capabilities, a reassurance that arrived at the exact moment grain shipments through the Azov Sea had already ground to a halt. There is something almost human in watching a government try to reassure its own population while the numbers underneath that reassurance keep getting worse. A ministry telling farmers and traders that everything remains under control, while the very canal that moves their grain sits closed and the ships that would carry it sit disabled in the water behind them, is not a confident government managing a minor inconvenience. It is a government narrating its way through a crisis it did not choose the timing of. Now the question arises, what was actually happening to Russia's oil economy itself, underneath all of that noise? The answer arrived from somewhere almost nobody was watching, over 1,300 kilometers from the nearest Ukrainian soldier. On the night of July 13th into the 14th, Ukraine's Special Operations Forces struck the Gazprom Neftekhim Salavat refinery complex, deep inside Russia's own Republic of Bashkortostan, a target sitting somewhere between 1,300 and 1,500 kilometers from Ukraine's border. The strike hit the facility's AVT-6 primary distillation unit, the actual heart of the refinery, the piece of machinery that takes raw crude oil and begins turning it into everything from gasoline to diesel. What makes Salavat different from every other refinery Ukraine had already struck throughout 2026 is timing rather than size. This was the last major gasoline-producing refinery in Russia that had not yet been hit this year. Every other significant target on that list had already fallen. Salavat processes roughly 10 million metric tons of crude oil annually, producing about 1.5 million tons of gasoline and 2.5 million tons of diesel every year, representing close to 2.7% of Russia's entire national refining capacity. A single strike had just closed the very last gap Russia had left standing. The operation carried a human element that deserves attention too, because Ukraine's own forces were not working alone on this one. The strike was carried out in coordination with Chornaya Iskra, translated roughly as Black Spark, a resistance movement operating quietly from inside Russia itself. Somewhere inside Russian territory, people willing to risk everything were feeding information toward a strike on their own country's infrastructure, helping guide a drone 1,300 kilometers from the nearest Ukrainian position onto one exact piece of machinery. That same night was not confined to a single target either, and this is where the scale of the operation becomes clear. Ukrainian forces simultaneously struck the Afipsky refinery in Russia's Krasnodar region for a second time. meaning two separate refineries, hundreds of kilometers apart, both went up in flame on the same night the Sea of Azov campaign was still burning through its final hours. Three completely different fronts: tankers in the Azov, 20 warships in Black Sea, and refineries deep inside Russian territory, all active on the exact same 24-hour window. Put those pieces together, and the real strategy behind all of it finally comes into focus. Russia's entire oil economy runs on two connected halves, getting crude oil out to buyers and turning crude oil into the fuel its own military and civilians actually use. Ukraine had just struck both halves within the same week. The feeder fleet paralysis meant large export tankers could no longer load efficiently, choking off the revenue side. The Salavat strike meant Russia's capacity to convert whatever oil it still had into usable gasoline and diesel was shrinking at the exact same moment. Losing export capacity and refining capacity together in the same 7-day window is a squeeze with no obvious countermove. Every piece of this puzzle now points in the same direction. A fleet Russia reflagged for its own protection had become a legally exposed target. A sea Russia once treated as an internal lake had emptied out within days, struck with a force, analysts compared to World War II. A canal and a strait Russia relied on for its own commerce sat closed by Russia's own hand. Russia was losing ships, losing shipping lanes, and losing the argument, all at exactly the same time, which raises an uncomfortable question for Moscow going forward. If 9 days in one sea could do all of this damage, what happens the moment this exact same campaign decides to stop being contained to the Sea of Azov and Black Sea at all? Drop your thoughts in comments. This is the Frontline Show. Something major is unfolding in Donetsk. Ukrainian forces have made moves that are catching attention across the battlefield, but what's really happening on the ground? Click this video for the full breakdown.